Perfect. Well, then we'll go ahead and get started. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Wicked Energy with JG. I'm here with Jordan Stone, petroleum engineer and associate at Donovan Ventures. Jordan, welcome to the show, man. How's everything in the venture world for you today?
Hey man, thanks for having me on, Justin. Life's good. I think the last quarter's been tough for energy, but I think the kind of next 3 years still look bright. So excited to get into it today.
Nice, nice. No, I appreciate that. We certainly have lots to talk about. We actually, first I want to give a shout out to Robert Smith. He's the one who connected us. You and I were kind of laughing because that dude, I don't know if he must figure out a way to make the day go beyond 24 hours because the amount of stuff that he does and the amount of work he puts in is great. And then on top of that, he's making connections. Yeah, again, want to give a shout out to Robert Smith. He's a stud. And so remind me how you met him golfing, right? I think.
Yeah, we had a foursome that was some Twitter guys, and
Okay.
Robert came one time, and we hit it off from day one. So he's been a great friend ever since.
Yeah, he has. He's always willing to give someone some time, man. He helped me out with a few things on the personal side, just on a little project I was working on. And again, he's just always willing to give a helping hand. So yeah, he's living in the AMI. And last time we talked, he hadn't been, but it sounds like he's living the good life down there, man. Have you talked to him lately?
Yeah, he's doing good. I think hedge fund life is keeping him busy, but I think he's doing what he was meant to do. He's certainly brighter at that than I am, and brighter than most. I think.
Yeah. No kidding. So you mentioned golf, man. Are you like a stick or are you for fun or what's that look like nowadays?
I played golf in high school, and I was a mediocre competitive golfer. For me, it was like I get to get out of class at 2 p.m. every day and hang out with my friends and play golf. Like, sure.
Yeah.
So I got a lot of muscle memory in early, and I don't practice much. So I'm like, 10 to 15 handicap probably. But I certainly enjoy it, and it's just a shame that there's about 3 months of the year here in Houston that kind of brutal to play.
Yeah, no, it is, man. It's unless you get out at like 7 in the morning, it's or even 8 is okay. But yeah, once you get to midday, it's painful out there. I know some guys. I was talking to a guy the other day who teed off at 2, and I was just like, man, you must be drinking a lot or something to kind of withstand the pain because that seems tough. Which in hindsight, I'm from Canada, and so you can only really play for like 3 or 4 months of the year. So I'll take the 3 or 4 months that you can because of how hot it is. But yeah, it's man, it's good. It's from a business perspective, a lot of times people don't understand, but there's actually there's a lot of value that you can take away from spending 4 hours in a golf cart with somebody, especially if you're tipping a few back. It's definitely a gentleman's business game. And ladies too. I've golfed with a lot of great ladies in the industry. But again, just the reality is it's mostly just a bunch of fellas out there trying to have fun. But nonetheless, that's great. Well, hopefully we can get out again at some point, or at least for the first time. But you mentioned Twitter, man, and I want to come out and start there. I was going to throw it down the list in the conversation, but since we got on that topic, I didn't realize Robert Smith was on Twitter for a long time, and then he kind of jumped off. But you seem to be in the crew or in the know on the EFT side, which is Energy Fin Twit for those who don't. Colin McLeland introduced it to me like a long time ago when it sort of started popping off. But like, what's your take on the whole EFT thing, man? It's kind of grew into this monster, and there's a lot of like really high level folks that are in it who remain anonymous, and it's just kind of its own weird little animal. But like, what's your take on it, man?
I think it's caused me to really change my kind of opinion about the potential benefit to social media. Like for years, I was nothing important can be said in 140 characters kind of mindset.
Yeah.
And then I got laid off from Halliburton at the end of 2019, along with half the rest of the industry. And I think there were a lot of us that had spent the previous 5 to 7 years kind of just pulling our hair out at some of the nonsense in the industry. And EFT was a really natural kind of fun way to commiserate, I guess. And I've been involved ever since. And I think the kind of tone and discourse changes as kind of the backdrop of the energy industry changes, but overall I think it's a great group of guys, and like I said, there's some very people in very high places on EFT that share their wisdom, and I think it's probably the best use of time for social media that I've found.
Yeah, and some of the stuff like the real time announcements or things like I've seen some things on there. I'm like, if your company got a hold of what you were saying, or even if whether you work there or not, it's like, yeah, it's fascinating. You kind of get an inside scoop on some things. And what I can so back in the day, the first person who I remember voicing their, I guess I would say opinions, but they were very much credible was David Ramsden Wood. He's and not to say he was on EFT first, but he like brought the like the raw truth to from oil and gas to LinkedIn, which got him in a bunch of trouble. And then that kind of like I feel like that was kind of the same time that EFT popped off. And then you had all these characters come on with like the funniest names, man. I just find it like some of the handles are great. They just play on words with oil and gas and energy. And I remember when it was when back in the day, it was like people were ramping up. No one was making money and it was volume over value. And everyone in EFT was like, this company is a dumpster fire and like these shale shit codes. And like, it was just like this huge deal. And I was like, this is fascinating. But then some of it got like more like just entertainment. But then some of it became like, okay, like there's actually some juice here. If you can kind of sift through all the crazy, you can actually learn a lot of what's happening, which again, I can appreciate. Um, would you say, and you may be in tuned a little bit more than myself. I've kind of scaled back just because I've been so busy. I haven't really messed with it too much, but like, how was it back then versus to how it is now? Like, is it still valuable for people to engage and read, or more, is it more like entertainment value?
Yeah, I think it's both, and that balance changes for sure. I've actually found it from DRW too. He had posted on his hot take of the day blog about a
Yeah.
Mr. Skilling post, and I saw that, and then I got into it. And then, of course, like 3 months later, Mr. Skilling was, shit posting at a DRW,
Yeah.
and then around that time, I think a big kind of catalyst for it was the Whiting white paper. I don't know if a lot of the listeners are familiar, but there was a group of 4 guys who put out, very in-depth 60-page slide deck showing Whiting's going to zero, and they put their money where their mouth was. And
Oh,
you know,
right.
some guys made 7-figure sums going short Whiting. And COVID, this was February 2020, so COVID certainly accelerated that. But I think
Yeah.
the thesis was so well laid out that was kind of a foregone conclusion. And they did a
Huh.
great job of showing that. And with that kind of sort of home run being available on the long side, it's some of these people going crazy with, the Centennials and Antiros of the world that barely scrape by. And then, in 2021, I think there was a lot of value there. Maybe there's less fat pitches like that at the moment, and it's maybe more
Sure.
entertainment value, but like the energy industry is volatile, and so many of us are trying to capture value from that volatility. So I think there's always going to be some value in following the discourse there.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to put it, man. Again, it's I've gotten tons of people more so on like just because a lot of folks were not necessarily on like the oil field service side. And so anytime I'd be talking to folks of trying to get them on, and man, it's just been funny. I had to bring it up because I know you're in it, and a lot of the folks we run around with are also too. But going back to just like yourself, you actually have a history of oil and gas. I remember when we had lunch, you were talking about, I think you, because you're from Louisiana, but you're like second or third generation oil and gas, aren't you?
Yeah. So I grew up in Dallas, but my mom's from Shreveport, dad's from Lake Charles, and I'm fourth generation oil field. So
Okay,
when
four.
I was in
Man.
eighth, when I was in eighth grade, I had the fortune to watch the third ever Haynesville well get fracked, and that was my uncle who, he's a geologist and would encourage the, you know, young 5-year-old me bringing home rocks and stuff. And then I watched in 2008 as he got in very early in the Haynesville and, created generational wealth. It seemed like it was out of nowhere. Of course, now I see that he was grinding for 20 years
Mm,
to put himself in a position to do that. But I think that was really a formative experience for me. And so I've kind of wanted to be in oil and gas roughly since then, kind of since high school. There's nothing else I really was seeking. And
nice.
it's been tough to stick with that over the arc, but I think there's still a lot of value in the industry, even though it took me some time to kind of come to terms with that, you know, lease at 500, drill one well and flip it through 30 grand an acre. You know, that's in the rear view, but I think it's
Right.
still a bright future for the industry. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, which I definitely want to talk about, which I mean kind of leads me into a question, and I find it interesting based off of people's experience or how long they've been in the industry, but are there any core beliefs around like oil and gas that you've changed your mind on over the last few years or like throughout the pandemic? Because I think a lot of sort of there's been a lot of pivotal moments and a lot of realization, energy supply, the rest of it. But does anything come to mind that has sort of changed your trajectory on sort of the outlook of just of oil and gas in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, I grew up, like I said, kind of hearing about oil and gas. And one of the things that was emphasized was this is a cyclical business. But I think over the last few years, I've kind of expanded my view of what that really means. You know, I beat my head against the wall working for Halliburton. And after that, you know, I never thought I'd ever be bullish OFS again. But just given the kind of the changes in the industry, there's kind of no absolutes over a full cycle. And so I think, you know, any kind of assessment of the way things are needs to kind of shift with that. And I've certainly kind of adjusted my opinions accordingly.
Nice. What would you say is an opinion you have now that you've got quite a bit of conviction under, whereas maybe you didn't earlier on?
You know, I think the idea that like OFS and frac and certain services are inherently bad businesses, and that, you know,
Mhm.
probably true over more of the cycle than some other areas of the value chain. But I think, you know, there's absolutely periods at each cycle where each of these business lines, you know, ends up in a situation that's you know, an asymmetric value, um, even in some of the commoditized mom and pop stuff. And so for me, kind of trying to be open minded about businesses that I'm maybe inherently biased against. I think I've tried to be open minded on that front.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think for a long time, folks in oil and gas, including myself, we had a high degree of closed mindedness. It was like, this is the way it is. It's us against the world. But I would say that over time, you know, people have just been more accepting to, you know, whether it's again, I don't play in the finance world. I'm on, you know, the drilling on the operations side and OFS. But just understanding that like, you know, we're not untouchable. Like obviously oil demand is going to be there for quite some time and gas, which you know means we're going to have to keep drilling for it. But just having that level of open-mindedness to accept you know, whether it's the way we do business, whether it's to we need to adopt technology, and just because this is the way we've always done it, you know, that's just that eventually is good until it's not, and when it's not, it can cost you a ton of money, and it can just deteriorate your business and the financials as well. So you know, is it like on the finance side, are people shifting the way I guess they view things, or is the investment sort of approach very similar? I don't know if that's a good question, but does that kind of make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. I think, you know, like most things, kind of the sentiment is, you know, a pendulum. There were a lot of areas within oil and gas that were, you know, uninvestable for large parts of the last 10 years. And I think, you know, part of that was we earned $500 billion in capex during you know, the first shale boom and returned none of that. Like you said, volume over value, and you know, that on top of ESG pressures and you know, questions about, you know, long-term demand for crude, the pendulum swung hard away from the industry for valid reasons. But you can see it coming back now, I think, as we kind of see some of the pitfalls of you know, energy transition investments and some of the ESG efforts that have been made. You know, there's no equilibrium for long with that kind of sentiment. So I think we're definitely seeing shifts now, and I think it'll continue to shift. And I think you know, people realize, like I said, there's no absolutes here. There's no black and white.
Yeah.
Energy is a hard thing to do, and the world needs it. And the answers aren't cut and dry. So I think
Right.
we'll always be changing our minds. You know.
That's true. That's true. So what does a guy like yourself do? You know, petroleum engineer, you're at Donovan Ventures. Like what do you spend your day to day doing at like a high level? Because I think there's a lot of folks, and especially younger folks, and I want to get into this afterwards. But when a lot of the younger folks are kids going to college, and they say, oh, you should get into oil and gas. Or if they were to hear that, they would think, oh, I'm just going to go like be a fracker, right? But there's so many industries, and whether you're interested in finance or whether it's science or, creativity. I mean, how there's marketing companies that are just, out there doing great for companies like ours, who have historically done no marketing. So there's literally a position for anybody. But going back to the question is like, what do you spend your time doing? And why does that excite you versus like going and, being an engineer behind the desk, planning wells, or even out in the field, firing away at sledgehammers and whatever else?
Yeah. So my day is, a pretty even split of kind of communicating with our existing portfolio companies, kind of assessing, new opportunities that come through the door, and a lot of time spent looking at, energy markets, activity levels, commodities, and trying to kind of make sense of the macro environment, which is pretty cloudy right now. I definitely think you made a good point that there's a lot of different ways to make a living in this industry. And like I said, my initial love for it was just, I thought geology was cool, and the predictive nature of exploration was really cool to me. But as I've grown, I think the, geopolitical implications and the macroeconomic influence of the industry is increasingly really interesting to me. And so I love that I get to spend a lot of time looking at that and talking about that. And coming from, background starting at Halliburton, yeah, some days it's a shame to be behind a desk. It'd be nice to be out in the field when the weather's nice and it's not, 2 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. But
Right.
I'm closer to find that balance that I think I've had so far, and I guess we're all kind of on the search for that.
Yeah. No, that's cool, man. I would imagine like whether it's Donovan Ventures or other similar companies, do a lot of folks like yourself go to I mean, obviously you're so busy, you may not have time, but is it uncommon for guys like yourself to go to the field and just like get boots on the ground to kind of hear what's happening in the field? Because I think there's value in doing that. I don't get to do it as much as I'd like to, just because I have so many responsibilities that require me to be in Houston. But is that sort of a thing, or do you miss that at all? Or
I mean, I think it's definitely important to kind of have ears out in the field, and I think that kind of even rolls into why I love EFT. I think it's a great venue for people to have the finance background to pick up on guys that are like Andy that are posting wireline
yeah,
educational content from West Texas, and similarly guys like that I think have a lot of opportunity to learn from the guys who are sitting in boardrooms making decisions. You know, from my end, the field, anecdotes and kind of data points, they matter a lot for decision making, even though they tend to be anecdotal.
hmm.
And my previous role, working in equity research, I think you get a lot, an outsized amount of credibility for understanding what's going on in the field and having recent anecdotes. And that's still true on the buy side as well. I think all the good guys are trying to keep in touch with their network from when they were in the field, so that they can what are we seeing from the finance side? What are you seeing from the field? There's always a constant flow there, and I think there's always value there.
Yeah, no, and that's honestly a lot of times the biggest disconnect is what's going on in the field versus what's going on in the office. And I speak purely from an operational standpoint. Is like, let's say we're drilling for Joe Blow Oil and Gas. Well, they want to do one thing to execute a drilling campaign, but then the field thinks it's like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just an engineer, went to school. I'm going to do it my way. And then you get this constant like back and forth. And then a lot of times the field doesn't want to tell the office one thing. And then the office is wondering why something's being executed, and they're getting results in ways that they like had no idea about, because that's not the way they planned it.
Mhm.
It's so, again, it's very much in a different world relative to where you're at. But I think, to your point, what I think is valuable about the EFT community, or just any social media, was like you can kind of help bridge the gap a little bit, and not necessarily like on a specific project, but just have a better understanding of what goes on in one person's world versus the other. Again, I think is fascinating, and like to have the EFT as a conduit, again, is going back to it. It's yeah, I think there's value there, and for a lot of the younger generation who are used to communicating in a much different way than an older generation, it provides them with an avenue, hopefully, to either communicate, to build their brand, to talk about their company, and to generate those conversations. I know there's a lot of companies out there trying to create like almost like energy Twitter type stuff, which may be challenging. I know Digital Wildcatters created Collide, which is kind of similar in a sense. But again, like, do you think there's going to be more and more emphasis on, I guess, moving more towards technology for whether it be information sharing, seeking, data sharing? I mean, is that a thing amongst your world, or not so much?
It is, and I think for a long time I've been of the opinion that a lot of the data sharing that does happen is, unfortunately kind of siloed. People protect data that, at the end of the day isn't, a trade secret or anything that's going to, hurt their competitive advantage. And, an example would be like, frac documentation. What you see on frac focus or state permitting is pretty minimal in a lot of places. And, simple things like, injection pressures and rates and stuff like that would be great to have publicly disclosed. And so I think that's part of the solution, is just, kind of maybe some better reporting. But on the other side of kind of data sharing, a lot of it happens in consortiums. There's a lot of, questions about who owns data. I hope that the industry can really work around some of those, legal issues to share better. And I think that'll also happen organically. This is a space that's going to continue to consolidate. So that kind of naturally brings data into, larger and larger pools, and hopefully people still feel incentivized and comfortable to share data as that process continues.
Yeah, no, that's, again, we see it, in our world as well. As when I came from Canada, you could easily go onto software. I think it was like government owned or province owned, but I could look up any well that was drilled in Alberta. I could look at all the information. I could look at all the drilling towers. I could look at like pretty much everything, related to a well. And then I came down here and it was like, oh, the only way you could get information from an offset well is like talking to so-and-so at another company. I was like, well, no, like, where's the central like platform that everyone can look at everything? And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, there's nothing like that. Are you kidding me? I was like, huh. So yeah, that was kind of a mindset shift that I had, is like, people held everything so close to their chest. Some operators more than others. And I'm sure you could guess who's out there that doesn't like to share much information, but I feel it's a kind of a limiter to growth, to some degree. And I understand too, there's a level of, if you hold on, if you're not willing to share information, it can kind of help give you a little bit of leverage. I remember when and they went public, Alta Mesa, and then they just basically burned into the ground, unfortunately. I remember hearing there was a gentleman there that was reluctant to share some drilling information because they were drilling so well. From his perspective, operationally, they were doing extremely well, which I felt like they were, but that's not really that relevant. But what he was not wanting to do is give anyone from a neighboring offset that may have wanted to look at buying them an advantage to drill better, because that was, for them, that was like a competitive advantage. And maybe there was a dollar value associated with their efficiencies. I don't really know, but I was like, okay, so there's a bit of a strategy as to like why we want to kind of hold information. Is that something that's true, or is that more just like ego driven and like we want to be the best and we don't want to share our secrets? Like, why?
I think it's still there to some extent, but I also think that, take water as kind of an example. We have, I think better communication and cooperation between offset operators these days, because a lot of these, minor logistical things, like what do I do with, my produced water? How do I get my, fresh or produced water back to my location for completions? Those sorts of things encourage people to work with their offsets. I hope that sort of progress isn't only driven by, regulatory risk. I think there's a lot of opportunity to increase it, but I see the signs of that. But on the other hand, there's always going to be, information barriers and NDAs. That's, just kind of a part of how business is done. So there's certainly limits, but I think in the whole, it's improving.
Gotcha.
I think technology certainly has a place to play in that. It's interesting to me that, like, in this business, there isn't that central silo. You have a bunch of different state platforms for production and well data that are all, chronically underfunded. And so now you create an opportunity for, the IHSs and Verises of the world to build a software as a service platform that, wouldn't exist with a system like Canada, like you said. And I think, there would be a business there, but the kind of, bottom of the barrel, just aggregating data from terrible platforms into a usable platform, like that's one that, we don't need that technology necessarily. It's an issue of reporting.
Gotcha. No, it's interesting. I'm going to pivot a little bit, and obviously you play in the private equity space. I'm just curious at a high level, not specific to Donovan Ventures, but kind of, where's the opportunity and where's the money flowing nowadays? Like, what are people hungry for? And again, what does that look like for folks that are maybe not in tune to what's happening in the private equity space?
Yeah, so I think looking at it more broadly, to kind of understand why private equity is the way it is right now, the pendulum is swinging maybe a little bit more sympathetic to the industry. After it got pretty ESG heavy here a couple years ago, there's still a lot of impediments to that capital coming back to the space. Despite the fact that energy was the #1 sector in the S&P in 2001 and 2022. There's not a lot of capital inflows into the space, and the same is true on the debt side. The RBL syndicates are smaller. They're looking at a smaller portion of the market when they think about who they want to lend to. And some of those effects I don't think are going to kind of improve with, less ESG concerns or even, better earnings from the industry. I think part of that is, related to interest rates. It's cost of capital is higher for everyone right now. And so that only exacerbates kind of those other issues. The other kind of, traditional, source of capital for the space that goes into private equity largely, as well as public equities, is your pensions endowments. Many of them have ESG mandates. Many of them got burned on energy last cycle. Many of them, have other issues like, just chronic underfunding or, mandates unrelated to oil and gas that cause issues for oil and gas. I think a lot of people don't realize it, but if you go out to raise money in private equity from a pension, they might put you, even if you're an energy sponsor, in the same bucket as, commercial real estate in a real assets bucket. And if I'm trying to talk to somebody who's managing, a portfolio that's 70% commercial real estate right now, no matter what their feelings on energy are, they've got bigger fish to fry right now. And on top of that scar tissue from last cycle, I think that can make it difficult. And so that source of kind of LP capital is harder to find these days. But what I think is also going to influence that is, what does shale really look like now? People want to call it shale 3.0 or whatever, but the bottom line is that companies aren't incentivized to grow the way they were last cycle.
Right.
Incentivized to return capital to shareholders, and that capital discipline is holding so far. And as a result of that, and the kind of exhaustion of a lot of the best acreage out there, growth in shales is going to be lower if we grow it all from here. That plus this consolidation, everything that can be sold to a major or a large cap will be, and what can't will be consolidated and then kind of rolled up. And so I think kind of the result of that is that the mega fund and large cap spaces are attracting most of the capital now. What capital is left is going to larger enterprises, and that leaves a real vacancy in the lower middle market where we play, and even in kind of the 500 million to $2 billion kind of enterprise, both on the private and public side. If you're an E&P in that space, it's it's going to be harder to find capital. If you're OFS, it's I don't know if there is a whole lot of capital out there, frankly. And so from our perspective, I think that's a big reason why our firm focuses in this area, is because the dynamics of capital availability are most severe here. And
Right.
I think, coming from a family that's got a lot of, mom and pop stripper well operators in it, I've seen that growing up, and it's real. And I don't know exactly how it'll play out this cycle, but I think there's certainly going to be a lot of changes, regulatory, you know, sources of finance, and we'll have to run with it and adapt. But that's one thing that our industry is always good at. So, like I said, still hopeful.
Right. No, that's like you said, we've always adapted and persevered when our backs are against the wall. Everyone, the whole world was, no more oil and gas. All of a sudden we come roaring back and generate returns that no one would have probably ever thought sitting there, March, April 2020, unless you had the foresight to realize that demand was going to come roaring back and we didn't have enough all after shutting everything in and dropping rig count and everything else. But the one thing I tend to think about quite a bit in my space is like looking at like right now, rig counts dropping, frac spreads are dropping. Somehow, U.S. production in the lower 48 production has been climbing up over the last few weeks after sitting around that 12.2, 12.3. Now we're at 12.7 all of a sudden, which I'm trying to figure out where that's coming from. But with all that being said, when you look at going into next year, are we setting ourselves up for a run on like a bull run here, and mainly in the US? And maybe that bull run is not the right term, but I have a hard time understanding. And I looked at some data. It looks like the best wells with the best production came on in 2021. 2022 was not as great, and 2023 so far is even worse. Are we, and ultimately the declines are crazy after 3 to 6 months, they're like falling right off. I say all that to say is like, I can't see, if demand continues on the way it does, we're going to be so underprepared to where, is there going to be enough money to be poured back into the industry, unless a lot of people were saving up money from all this free cash flow that they're still generating. Like, where's the money going to come from? And at that point, will people say, oh my goodness, here's a good opportunity? Or a lot of they did big funds and the endowments and stuff are still going to say, well, no, we're not focused on oil and gas because of, climate crisis and all the rest of it. I mean, I just have a hard time seeing us at rig count not having to increase, or why we're not maintaining the levels that we are, but we're still dropping rigs.
Yeah, I think there's still a potential for us to break kind of that 13.2 million barrel a day record output in the lower 48, or in the US kind of overall. But we're not the marginal, growth barrel at a global scale anymore, even if we can get back above 13.2. And I think the dialogue around underinvestment is fascinating. Rystad put out a report a few weeks ago, kind of taking the other side, that like, is it really, are we really underinvesting, and taking a look at efficiencies and things like that. And don't necessarily agree with either side. So like I said, I try not to be absolutist either way, but you can definitely see some signs that underinvestment is not a mortal fact at this point. The discoveries in Guyana and Namibia are excellent examples of creating and finding new reserves, and there's a lot of runway there. I think you also look at what is happening offshore in the Middle East. The jackup market there is kind of picking up in a pretty big way, and so there are some engines of growth, but they tend to be international now. And also efficiency is real. The big kind of theme that I saw going out of COVID was that when we try and ramp, labor is going to be an issue.
Yeah.
And that sort of panned out, but at the end of the day, feet drilled per day, completed per day, we continue to set records at a lot of these metrics. And so I think there's kind of a tale of two sides. In the US, we have probably underinvested if you kind of take the view that those efficiencies are plateauing. I think they probably are. Only so many wells can be simul-fracked, just from a logistical perspective. And, at a certain point, the laws of physics prevent you from drilling 4 feet per day. But,
Right.
at the same time, I'm less concerned about, that underinvestment here in the US, because we're just not going to be the global, marginal growth barrel in this cycle. And when you look internationally, yeah, there's a lot of projects that are behind schedule, that have been canceled, that have, environmental concerns or above ground risk and things. But there are options. There's off ramps. I think we're certainly setting ourselves up for tightness, though.
Mhm.
If the kind of thesis around Chinese demand growth, were true, I think would probably already be pretty tight.
Right.
And I don't have any particular insights on kind of how that sorts itself out. But what I do believe is that, on the 5 to 10 year time span, places like India, Nigeria, there's a lot of developing countries around the world, and they are going to continue to grow demand. People are going to continue to move into the middle class and prosper, and fossil fuels are going to be a big part of that. And so I tend to think that demand for the next 5 to 10 years is looking good. Supply is tenuous, but there's some options there. But also, I think the gas side's a little different. I think the issues there in the US, we're already hitting all-time highs every week, and
Yeah.
we certainly have a lot more inventory for unconventional gas in the US than we do crude. But globally speaking, it's still a pretty fragmented market, and LNG build out and more pipe will hopefully start to alleviate some of those regional issues. But it's a different market there, and I also think that there's truth that natural gas is the best transition fuel we've got, and it's the best lever we have to pull today to reduce overall emissions, and
Right.
that will certainly support natural gas demand over the foreseeable future.
Yeah. No, I tend to, again, in my role in the company, I try and do as much research as I can just to kind of understand, where rig count's going, because we live and breathe by rig count. And so the natural gas side for us is interesting. And so I'm curious, with the LNG export capacity coming online over the next, I think it's by 2026, there's going to be 3 other terminals ready to go. There seems to be some contracts in place. Do you think, well, is there going to be enough infrastructure to support that export? Are you like, do you pay attention to the midstream side much at all? Like, where's the pipelines being built? I went on to I think it was RBL Energy's website. They have it's a table along with a map, so you can see where pipelines are either under construction, proposed, everything else. I was trying to throw some, do back the envelope math to see where we stand. But again, are we going to have enough infrastructure to support the export capacity based off of, say, pipeline capacity where we're at now?
I think that's a big concern. Even in the Gulf Coast, I don't know if anyone's ever going to build a pipeline to kind of connect the Texas Haynesville and Louisiana Haynesville systems across that border, because it's looking like we're going to have 2 parallel kind of trunks, both interstate, and that gets worse when you look at the Northeast. MVP, I think, is an example of a lot of issues with kind of the regulatory space, and MVP maybe isn't the most important in terms of LNG, but it's indicative of the issues with building infrastructure in general, and not even just for oil and gas. I think a lot of people have talked about the transmission lines that Philip Anschutz, an oil and gas business owner, as well as many others. He's trying to build transmission lines to take wind power from the Rockies to your West Coast demand centers, and he can't even get those built. And so it's really a broader issue. And I think that the issues it presents to LNG are real in the US. That said, I think there's also a question of international infrastructure, because we saw this with European gas over the last 12 months, which has been crazy. But they went into a mad rush to buy every spot cargo of LNG they could, to the point where we had 37 vessels sitting off of Europe because they didn't have enough regas capacity to, offload those cargoes. And there's only so much, suitable geology for storage space in Europe. So infrastructures, even if they can get that regas built, even if they can build more pipe, there's a lot of other issues to consider. But the other piece being, when you think about who's buying LNG, largely, Japan, South Korea, there's a lot of Southeast Asia and also developing countries around the world that have kind of been impacted by that dynamic, and they need infrastructure across the entire natural gas value chain if they can really, if they're going to leverage natural gas, like I said, to bring themselves in the middle class and prosper. I think an example is, Bangladesh and Pakistan have both had issues holding onto their regas, floating regas facilities and managing to get their cargoes. And I think it's a human problem. Everyone wants to talk about ESG, but like not the S or the G for the most part. And the social implications of people in the developing world not having access to LNG and the infrastructure solutions to that are big questions that I hope get more attention as we go forward.
Fascinating. No, again, as time goes on, I find myself more interested in seeing, trying to look around the corner where gas is going. It's a fascinating market. When we were at $9, I thought it was going to hang in there, and then all of a sudden it was a warm winter, and now here we are at like 250, whatever it is. But I was looking at online the other. There was some research that I saw. I guess they're forecasting for another real warm winter over in Europe and for the rest of the world. My boss was saying that he thinks it's going to be a cold, wet winter here in Texas. But fact of the matter is, it looks like the NOAA is forecasting a warm winter, which wouldn't bode well for those who are hoping for higher natural gas prices. Have you heard kind of what the winter's looking like?
I think the gas traders and meteorologists probably know that better than I do.
Sure.
I think if you look at the strip for natural gas right now, Henry Hub, I think the 2.5 BCF a day roughly of capacity for LNG that's going to come online over the next couple of years is probably driving kind of that the shape of that curve right now more than anything. And the way that the kind of 23 winter portion of the curve has shifted over the last few months hasn't been super dramatic. And so I don't know how much weather is influencing it yet, but if it's warm, Europe's, I think, on track to hit 90% storage probably by October. So there's certainly the potential to see a bit of a glut this winter in a lot of places around the globe if it's warm.
Yeah. Well, again, we'll see. I want to shift again, and I want to talk a little specific on the Permian. And you brought up a very interesting point when we met about one of the biggest challenges that you've seen, and it was to do, I believe, with water and the volumes that we're injecting. Again, I would love for you to kind of share that, because it's a neat thought exercise for those who either work in the Permian or who are tied to SWDs and just in general on the operations side out there. It's I think there's some big implications that aren't being considered. And if you kind of give an overview as to what that was.
Yeah. I think my kind of fascination with oil field water started when I was at OU. Undergrad at OU was around the time that we started having earthquakes due to Arbuckle injection associated with the Mississippi Lime in Oklahoma. The solution there was stop injecting in the Arbuckle, and if you've got to pump the brakes big time on Mississippi Lime development in the meantime, fine. The world can live without, Sand Ridge's gas. Well, when I started seeing, 3 magnitude, 4 magnitude, and 5 magnitude quakes coming out of West Texas, it gave me a lot of concern. And if you look at a chart, it's easy to pull up on the USGS or the TexNet seismic portals, but it's an exponential growth, and it tracks well with production volumes on the water side. And the Delaware has some of the best rate of return of any unconventionals in the US. But we're producing, 3 to 5 barrels of water per barrel of oil there.
Yeah.
Midland's a little bit better, but the Bakken and the Eagle Ford are both much lower water cut. And as those basins decline and we try to offset those declines with Permian production, as well as grow overall, the engine of growth is the Permian, and the water growth there, and that portion of the story, I think, has been underappreciated. The last couple of years, it's definitely got a lot more attention. The 5.0 that happened, just north of Midland, right around Christmas, it got me a call from management who finally wanted to talk water, and it was 8 p.m. on a Friday night.
Oh, wow.
And I was happy to finally be able to kind of talk about that, because there's debates around exactly what's causing the seismic, but there's no doubt that it's associated, the vast majority of these incidents, with injection. And there's only so many zones we can inject in that don't either pressure up and cause drilling hazards like the San Andreas has in the Midland Basin, or cause seismic issues like some of the deeper facilities can do. And the more we emphasize Permian growth, and the more, like I said, Bakken and Eagle Ford begin to decline, the more we're going to have to find a solution to this problem. And it's interesting to me. We've only got one public water midstream firm, Eris Water Solutions. Some could argue that Select, WTTR is another example. But so far, the market's saying this is an oilfield services business. It's not worth a pipeline multiple. And that's at odds with the investment thesis that drove a lot of private equity sponsors and other investors to start building water midstream firms, over the last few years. And at some point, we got to reconcile that, as well as, come to terms with, cooperation across state lines, not just offset operators. We need the Railroad Commission and New Mexico. We need them to be talking. And my understanding is those offices are not on speaking terms. And if we don't fix that, DC will, and they probably won't fix it, but they will certainly try.
Right. Which we would want to avoid if possible, right? We want to try and fix it ourselves before I get the government to come in and who don't really understand the business, try and fix a problem that we could probably fix a lot more effectively if we just actually paid attention and allocated enough resources to it, right? Because it's again, I don't, and again, I'm totally disconnected from that side of it, but it's I don't know if it makes money. I'm sure there's opportunity if you could create a company to help with that, whatever that looks like. Again, if there was a ton of money to be made there, I think people would jump on it, and maybe there is, and they're just too focused on what we do best. I don't know. It's a tough call, and I'm certainly not the one to answer it, but
I haven't found the answer yet. It's something that I'm constantly thinking about, but at the end of the day, I've heard every complaint about frack, every criticism possible being a frack engineer. And I don't shy away from telling people, even if I'm in Denver or whatever, that's what I do.
Yeah.
But the one that I believe is truly a valid criticism of hydraulic fracturing is the way it impacts the water cycle at a local and a national level. The industry's made great progress on using recycled water for frack, and in a lot of different areas of the water value chain, but there's a lot of work still to be done. And so for me, I think if we're going to be truly altruistic and humanitarian about the impact of this industry, we need to solve that problem, as well as the economic and kind of regulatory risks. It's something that we've got to deal with more urgently, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think this stuff needs to be communicated and talked about, and hopefully folks listening, who knows, might spark up another conversation that leads to some action, which is the whole goal. But lastly, the way I want to close out is just at a high level, talking about branding and how us in oil and gas can, like, what could we do better? And again, someone like yourself who's up and coming leadership executive, it seems like a lot of folks are not trying to jump into oil and gas. Even when oil was over 100, it didn't seem like too many people were still fond of trying to get into the industry. But like, what could we do as an industry to continue drumming up attention, awareness, and hopefully make it attractive for talented individuals coming out of college or out of high school to get into the industry and help solve some of these big problems that we're faced with?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Personally, I think we need a figurehead, someone who's charismatic. I love a lot of what Alex Epstein writes. I think his approach in media can be a little bit confrontational and in some circles. But to me, the Rice guys are some of the best evangelists we have, and I think the Chris Wright from Liberty's making a strong effort to talk about these subjects, and I think empowering them and kind of trying to circle the wagons and get behind some of those thought leaders in the industry without bickering over whatever our other issues. If we have a figurehead that is charismatic, that can tell stories that are backed up by data, but not talking like he's talking to a bunch of engineers, I think there's progress there. And there's also progress to be made internally. Like I said, the U.S. isn't going to be the marginal growth barrel of the cycle, and that means we need to be in our academic circles, our universities, our professional organizations more inclusive of people from around the world who want to become petroleum engineers, geologists, landmen, whatever it may be. And part of that is marketing. Part of that is cultural, and it's sorely needed. There's no doubt that we're losing the PR war, and the talent issue is going to be an issue as long as that PR war is not in our favor.
Well, I tend to disagree, because ChatGPT is just going to do it all for us, man. Like drilling engineer, ChatGPT, folks, everyone, you name it, AI solution to the whole thing. I joke, but that'll certainly help in some areas. But to your point, I mean, again, I've done this since I was 18. Started, scrubbing toilets on a drilling rig to here we are today. And if I was to do it again, I don't know if I would want to go do that, but I wouldn't change it for the world. And to try and convince a young, hardworking individual to go scrub a rig for 2 weeks at a time, especially nowadays, is pretty tough. But again, I think we got to do a great job. And it sounds silly, man, but I think we need to be creating content around, what we do, how we do it, make it fun. Again, it sounds all cliche, but the reality is like, you need to find the underpriced attention and capture the emotions of those. And if you like I got interviewed by these gentlemen. One was out of Boston. He works for a medical company. And then the other one works at San Francisco, works for Tesla. I got interviewed, and they were like, man, we came across you. We love like your style, this and that. And they're like, can you kind of share some stuff about oil and gas? And so I was able to get on a podcast and talk to, like, their audience is all from like 18 to 24 years old, up in the Northeast and in California. And at the end of the conversation, they were like, man, this was so informative. And like, I was trying to make a point. I said, you want to make an impact to the world. I said, the reality is a lot of these oil and gas companies don't set demand. We supply what the demand is. And therefore, if we can find folks from around the world to help solve the problems and generate the cleanest barrels we can possible, that's going to move the needle. Because I said, in the short run, we're going to need to produce it. And I said, why not, if you want to make an impact? Again, there's several ways, but one way for sure is to have that perspective and that amount of, just drive to make the world a better place. Come in oil and gas and help us, because we need it. You know what I mean? Like, so again, there's so many opportunities to drive change and make impact, and invite everyone with open arms. Because if we don't, eventually we're going to be left with holding the bag. And like you said, we're not really winning the PR world. And so maybe some creative folks can come help us in that space too. Because again, like, we need it, and it goes back to, it's like, well, this is how we've always done it. Is eventually just, it's gonna cause some grief, and then we're gonna let the rest of the world produce a bunch of oil and gas and make a bunch of money. And it's like, we don't want that. So maybe more folks need to get on TikTok and EFT, and everyone will just funnel in.
Yeah. I certainly think that EFT has one of the better communities that's, inclusive, educational, charismatic, funny,
Right.
and that's all the things that the the industry doesn't have kind of in our global mouthpieces at the moment.
That's it. Well, Jordan, this has been great. We're coming up on an hour here. I really appreciate your time. And the one last question I have, I like to close out with is to for the folks to kind of get to know maybe a little bit more about you. Is if you on a Friday night, if you could do anything in the world, you could spend it with whoever, you had all the money in the world, what would that look like? What would Jordan Stone do to disconnect and do whatever? What's that look like?
For me, it'd probably be, hanging out by the pool with friends, playing guitar,
Nice.
drinking beer, riding four-wheelers, stuff like that. That's a pool with a view of the country and good friends around is where I hope to spend my retirement.
Wow, that's probably not that far away. I feel like you could probably do that every once in a while. So you say guitar, man. You play guitar or what?
I do, and it's something I've done since I was in middle school, but
Nice.
I recently did my first open mic earlier this year at the suggestion of another EFTer. So
Yes. Where
from
was it?
it was at Swanee's Grill here in Houston that does kind of 60s, 70s, classic rock, singer-songwriter, my kind of
No
good
way.
music.
Yeah.
But I think the EFT musical community needs to grow too. Maybe that's how we finally get the attention of the Gen Zs.
Dude, I never would have thought, man. So you sing too?
I do. I'm working on a couple EFT parody songs. I got nothing on Don Jr. He's the king, but we
Man,
got some things in the mix.
I would throw you on the spot because anytime someone's ever come on to my podcast who says they sing, I'm like, okay, you've set yourself up. Now you got to sing. So I don't know if you can close out with a little chorus or something, man, because you've basically said to everyone you did open mic and you are a performer.
Oh, let's see. I'm trying to think of something oil field.
Yeah, you got it, man. One bar. That's it. That's all we need.
You came from West Texas in a Mercedes Benz with your Louis Vuitton and your debutante friends. Your stepmom came with you to watch you unpack. She'll go home in the Gulf Stream when it's time to go back to Midland.
Yes, dude.
John Bowman, TCU boy, for those who don't know him, but
Everyone out
Oilfield,
there. That was great. That
Oilfield
was the best.
Country is gonna be part of the PR push if I've got anything to say about it.
Dude, that was money. That's the best way to close out. I don't even need to say anything. Everyone appreciate it. Hook up with Jordan on LinkedIn. I don't know where else you play on, but nonetheless, it's been fascinating. I appreciate it. And for everyone out there, always remember that we is greater than me. Thanks, everybody.